The encounter that changed everything. Ethan Grayson stood on the balcony of his penthouse, a towering glass fortress overlooking the bustling heart of the city. At just 30 years old, he had achieved what many could only dream of: an empire in technology, billions in the bank, and global recognition as a business genius. Yet, for all his wealth, Ethan felt a gnawing emptiness, a void that his luxury cars, designer suits, and sprawling estate couldn't fill. The city's hum below seemed distant, muted by his thoughts. The evening breeze carried a faint chill, and Ethan took a deep breath, trying to shake off the suffocating loneliness that seemed to shadow him everywhere. His parents had passed away in a plane crash 5 years earlier, leaving him the company and the crushing burden of their expectations. Though surrounded by people at work and social events, Ethan often felt like an actor in someone else's life, following a script he hadn't written. One evening, seeking to escape the confines of his hollow world, Ethan decided to drive through the city in his custom sports car. The roar of the engine brought a fleeting sense of freedom as he navigated through the maze of streets. As he entered a quieter, less affluent neighborhood, something caught his attention. A figure hunched by the side of the road, rummaging through a pile of discarded items near an overflowing trash can. Ethan slowed his car, curiosity and an unfamiliar pang of concern drawing him closer. It was a woman, her hair a tangle of silver, her frame frail and trembling against the evening chill. Her clothes were patched and mismatched, her shoes worn to the soles. Despite her obvious struggle, there was a quiet dignity in the way she moved, as if clinging to the last threads of her pride. Without thinking, Ethan parked his car by the curb and approached her. His polished leather shoes seemed out of place against the cracked pavement. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, hesitant. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman straightened slowly, her blue eyes meeting his. They were tired but piercing, filled with a depth that startled him. "I'm fine, young man," she replied, her voice raspy but steady, "just looking for something to eat." Her words struck him like a blow. In his world, hunger was an abstract concept, something he read about or saw in documentaries. But here it was, raw and real, standing right before him. "What's your name?" he asked. The woman hesitated, as if deciding whether to trust him. "Margaret," she finally said, though her voice faltered slightly. "But most folks call me Maggie." "Maggie," Ethan repeated, offering her a gentle smile. "I'm Ethan, and I think I can help you." Maggie looked at him warily. "Why would you want to help someone like me?" she asked, her tone tinged with suspicion. Ethan paused, searching for an answer that didn't feel hollow. "Because everyone deserves a chance," he said at last. "And maybe I need to do something meaningful for once." Maggie's expression softened, but her caution remained. "I've been on the streets for months," she said, her gaze drifting to the ground. "Lost my home after I couldn't pay rent. Been trying to get by, but it's hard. Too hard." Ethan nodded, a surge of determination rising within him. "Come with me," he said, gesturing toward his car. "I have a guest house on my property. It's warm, safe, and empty. You can stay there as long as you need." Maggie's eyes widened in disbelief. "You'd do that for me? A stranger?" "Sometimes," Ethan said with a small smile, "a stranger is exactly who we need." After a moment's hesitation, Maggie nodded. Ethan led her to his car, opening the passenger door and helping her in. As they drove, the city lights gave way to tree-lined streets and gated estates. Maggie stared out the window, her expression a mix of wonder and apprehension. When they arrived at Ethan's estate, Maggie's jaw dropped. The sprawling mansion was a marvel of modern architecture, its glass walls glowing warmly in the night. The guest house, though smaller, was no less impressive, nestled amidst a garden that seemed to belong in a fairy tale. Ethan guided Maggie inside, showing her the cozy living room, the fully stocked kitchen, and the neatly arranged bedroom. "This is all for you," he said. "Take your time to settle in. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the next steps." Maggie stood in stunned silence, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," Ethan replied. "Just rest." That night, as Maggie lay in a real bed for the first time in months, Ethan sat in his own room, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose, fragile but real. Little did he know that this single act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. Unlikely bonds and hidden stories. The morning sun filtered through the wide windows of the guesthouse, bathing the cozy interior in a warm glow. Maggie woke to a sensation she hadn't felt in months. Safety. The bed beneath her was soft, and the scent of freshly laundered sheets surrounded her. For a moment, she lay still, letting the reality sink in. She wasn't on the streets anymore. She had a roof over her head and a kind stranger to thank. Maggie got up slowly, her body aching from months of sleeping on cold ground. She found the guesthouse's small kitchen and was surprised to see it fully stocked with fruits, bread, milk, and even a coffee machine. As she made herself a simple breakfast, the sound of a knock at the door startled her. Opening the door, she found Ethan standing there, holding a small box. He was dressed casually in jeans and a simple shirt, far from the intimidating image of the billionaire she'd assumed him to be. "Good morning," he said, flashing a warm smile. "I brought you something." Maggie gestured for him to come in, her curiosity piqued. He handed her the box, and when she opened it, her eyes widened. Inside was a brand new smartphone, sleek and shiny. "I thought you might need a way to stay connected," Ethan explained, "in case you need anything or just want to talk." Maggie hesitated, touched by the gesture but unsure if she should accept. "Ethan, this is too much. I don't even know how to thank you for what you've already done." "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Think of it as a tool to help you get back on your feet." She nodded, tucking the phone back into its box. "You're very kind," she said quietly. "I don't know what I did to deserve this." Ethan shrugged, leaning casually against the kitchen counter. "Maybe it's not about what you did. Maybe it's about what we can do for each other." The words hung in the air, and Maggie studied Ethan for a moment. Despite his wealth and polished demeanor, there was a sadness in his eyes, a loneliness that resonated with her own. She decided to trust him, at least for now. Over the next few days, Maggie began to settle into her new environment. Ethan made it a point to visit her every morning, bringing coffee and breakfast pastries. Slowly, the initial awkwardness between them faded, replaced by a genuine camaraderie. They began to share bits and pieces of their lives, weaving a fragile but meaningful connection. Maggie learned that Ethan had lost his parents in a tragic accident and had been thrust into the role of CEO at an age when most were still figuring out their lives. He spoke of long hours, endless meetings, and a suffocating sense of responsibility. Sometimes, he admitted one morning over coffee, "I feel like I'm just a cog in this giant machine. The money, the success, it doesn't mean much when you don't have anyone to share it with." Maggie nodded, her heart aching for him. "Loneliness doesn't care how much money you have," she said softly. "It finds you anyway." Ethan studied her, his green eyes thoughtful. "What about you, Maggie? What was your life like before all this?" For a moment, Maggie hesitated. Her past was a tangle of joy and pain, triumph and loss. But something about Ethan's sincerity made her want to open up. "I used to be a painter," she said finally. "A pretty good one, too. My work was in galleries, and I even had a few exhibitions. Painting was my whole world." Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. "What happened?" Maggie's gaze grew distant, her voice tinged with regret. "Life happened. I fell in love with someone who didn't believe in me, who thought my art was a waste of time. He took a lot from me. By the time I left him, I had nothing. Not my confidence, not my career, not even my brushes." Ethan felt a wave of anger on her behalf. "That's awful," he said, No one should have the power to take away what you love. Maggie smiled sadly. It's in the past now. Or at least, that's what I tell myself. The more Ethan learned about Maggie, the more he admired her resilience. Despite everything she had endured, there was a quiet strength in her, a spark that refused to be extinguished. He couldn't shake the feeling that she had more to offer the world, that her story wasn't over yet. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Ethan stopped by the guest house with an idea. He knocked, and Maggie opened the door, looking surprised to see him so late. "Ethan," she said, "is everything all right?" He smiled, holding up a small bag. "I have a surprise for you." Inside the bag were art supplies, brushes, paints, and a few blank canvases. Maggie's hands trembled as she pulled them out, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ethan, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "I just thought you might want to paint again. No pressure, of course. But if it makes you happy, then I want you to have this." For a long moment, Maggie stared at the supplies, a flood of emotions washing over her. She felt a mix of fear, excitement, and gratitude. Finally, she looked up at Ethan, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." The next morning, Ethan found Maggie in the guesthouse's sunroom, her hands smudged with paint, a canvas propped on an easel in front of her. She was completely absorbed, her brush moving with a confidence that surprised even her. The painting was a landscape, a vibrant depiction of a sunset over a meadow, bursting with color and emotion. Ethan watched from the doorway, a smile tugging at his lips. He didn't want to disturb her, but Maggie noticed him and turned, a little self-conscious. "Sorry," she said, setting down her brush. "I got carried away." "Don't apologize," Ethan said, stepping inside. "It's beautiful. You're amazing." Maggie flushed at the compliment but couldn't hide her smile. For the first time in years, she felt like the artist she used to be, the person she had almost forgotten. Over the following weeks, Maggie painted every day, pouring her heart and soul into her work. Her paintings were vibrant and alive, each one telling a story of resilience and hope. Ethan, in turn, found himself drawn to her world, captivated by the way she saw beauty in even the simplest things. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, but neither of them could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead. Secrets from the past were about to surface, and with them, new trials that would test their newfound friendship and their strength as individuals. A new dawn for Maggie. As the days turned into weeks, Maggie's transformation became evident not just to Ethan, but to herself. The canvases in the sunroom began filling up with vibrant landscapes, soulful portraits, and abstract expressions of emotion. Each brushstroke seemed to breathe life into the parts of her that had been dormant for so long. Ethan, though busy with his work, made it a point to stop by every evening to see her progress. One evening, Maggie was finishing a piece when Ethan arrived, holding 2 cups of coffee. He paused in the doorway, admiring her work. The painting depicted a lone figure standing at the edge of a forest, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground. It was haunting yet beautiful, filled with a sense of quiet resilience. "You've outdone yourself again," Ethan said, handing her one of the cups. Maggie turned, her face glowing with pride and a hint of embarrassment. "It's not much," she said, though the smile tugging at her lips betrayed her modesty. "Just something I've been working on." "It's incredible," Ethan insisted, taking a sip of his coffee. "There's so much emotion in it. It's like the figure is standing on the edge of something, like they're deciding whether to move forward or stay where they are." Maggie nodded, her gaze drifting back to the painting. "I think that's how I've felt for a long time," she admitted. "Stuck. Unsure if I had the strength to move forward. But now, I don't know. Things feel different." Ethan smiled, a warmth spreading through him at her words. "That's because you're rediscovering who you are. And who you are is amazing." Maggie chuckled softly, shaking her head. You give me too much credit, Ethan. I wouldn't even be here if it weren't for you. And I wouldn't be half as inspired if it weren't for you, Ethan replied. You've reminded me what it means to find joy in something meaningful. Their conversations grew deeper as the weeks passed, often lingering late into the night. Maggie shared stories of her youth, of the small art studio she had once rented in the city, and the thrill of seeing her work displayed in galleries. She spoke of the man who had stolen her joy, Richard, and how she had finally mustered the courage to leave him, though it had cost her everything. Ethan, in turn, opened up about his own struggles. He told Maggie about his parents, how they had built their company from the ground up, and how their sudden death had left him both grieving and burdened with responsibility. I inherited their empire, he said one evening, his voice tinged with sadness. But I didn't inherit their passion. I spent years running a company that feels more like a machine than a dream. Maggie listened intently, her heart aching for him. Maybe you need to find something that's yours, she suggested, something that makes you feel alive. Ethan considered her words, a thoughtful expression on his face. Maybe I do, he said, and maybe helping you find your way back to art is a part of that. One day, as Maggie worked on a particularly ambitious piece, a sprawling canvas filled with swirling colors and textures, Ethan arrived with a surprising announcement. I've been thinking, he began, watching her mix paints on a palette. You've created so many beautiful pieces. It's time the world saw them. Maggie froze, her brush hovering over the canvas. What do you mean? She asked cautiously. I mean an exhibition, Ethan said, his eyes lighting up. We'll rent a gallery, invite collectors, critics, everyone. Your work deserves to be seen. Maggie shook her head, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. Ethan, I can't. I'm not ready for something like that. It's been years since I was part of the art world. What if no one likes my work? What if they think it's amateurish? They won't, Ethan said firmly. I've seen your paintings, Maggie. They're extraordinary, and even if you're scared, I'll be right there with you. Maggie hesitated, torn between doubt and the faint spark of hope Ethan's words ignited. Finally, she nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. All right, she said. Let's do it. But only because you believe in me. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan tapped into his extensive network, securing a prestigious gallery in the city's art district. He hired a marketing team to design invitations and promote the event, and he worked closely with Maggie to select the pieces that would be displayed. Maggie, though nervous, found herself swept up in the excitement. For the first time in years, she felt like the artist she had once been. She poured her heart into preparing for the exhibition, tweaking details on her paintings and even creating a few new pieces. Ethan, ever the supportive friend, was there every step of the way. He accompanied her to meetings with gallery staff, encouraged her when her self-doubt crept in, and even helped transport her paintings to the gallery. Through it all, their bond deepened, built on mutual respect and a shared sense of purpose. Finally, the night of the exhibition arrived. Maggie stood in the gallery's back room, dressed in an elegant black dress Ethan had helped her pick out. Her hands were clammy, and her heart pounded as the sound of voices drifted in from the main hall. You ready? Ethan asked, appearing at her side. He was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his green eyes warm with encouragement. Maggie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I don't know, she admitted. What if it's a disaster? It won't be, Ethan said confidently. And even if it were, it wouldn't matter. What matters is that you're here, showing the world who you are. That's brave, Maggie, and I'm proud of you. His words bolstered her courage, and together they stepped into the main hall. The sight that greeted them was overwhelming. The gallery was packed with people, critics, collectors, and art enthusiasts, all admiring Maggie's work. Conversations buzzed, and Maggie heard snippets of praise. Incredible use of color, so much emotion, absolutely stunning. As the evening wore on, Maggie's nerves began to fade, replaced by a sense of awe and gratitude. People approached her to compliment her work, ask about her process, and express interest in purchasing her pieces. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a broken woman, but as an artist, a creator, someone with something valuable to offer the world. Ethan watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride as he saw Maggie shine. But as he stood there, a man in the crowd caught his eye. A tall, middle-aged figure with a piercing gaze fixed on Maggie. Ethan's instincts prickled. Something about the man's demeanor felt off, almost predatory. The man began moving toward Maggie, and Ethan's protective instincts kicked in. He wove through the crowd, arriving at her side just as the man reached her. "Maggie," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. "It's been a long time." Maggie's face went pale, her hands gripping the edge of a nearby table for support. "Richard," she whispered. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and he stepped slightly in front of Maggie, shielding her. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Richard's gaze shifted to Ethan, a smirk playing on his lips. "No problem," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Just catching up with an old acquaintance." Ethan didn't move, his presence a silent warning. Maggie, regaining some of her composure, straightened and met Richard's gaze. "You're not welcome here," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Please leave." For a moment, Richard seemed amused, as if testing how far he could push. Then, with a mocking bow, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Maggie exhaled shakily, and Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Who was that?" he asked gently. Maggie hesitated, her expression troubled. "My ex-husband," she said finally. "The one who took everything from me." Ethan's jaw tightened, a wave of anger and protectiveness washing over him. "He's not going to hurt you again," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." As the night wore on, Maggie couldn't shake the unease Richard's appearance had stirred. But as she looked around at the gallery filled with people celebrating her work, she reminded herself of how far she had come. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope, fragile but real, blooming in her heart. Little did she know, the shadows of her past were not so easily banished. The challenges ahead would test her strength, her resolve, and the bond she had formed with Ethan. But for now, she held on to the moment, determined to savor the victory she had fought so hard to reclaim. Shadows of the past. The buzz of the exhibition lingered long after the last guest had left the gallery. Maggie stood in the now empty hall, gazing at her paintings, which hung proudly on the walls. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of pride, a warmth that spread through her chest and filled the void that had consumed her for so long. Yet that pride was tainted by the unease of Richard's sudden reappearance. Ethan walked up beside her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. He had stayed behind to ensure everything was in order, and more importantly, to make sure Maggie was okay. "You were incredible tonight," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Everyone loved your work. You should be proud." Maggie smiled faintly, but her eyes betrayed her lingering anxiety. "Thank you, Ethan. I couldn't have done this without you." "You did the hard part," Ethan replied, his gaze steady. "I just gave you a push." Maggie hesitated, the smile slipping from her face. "But Richard, he ruined everything once before. What if he tries to do it again?" Ethan's expression hardened, his green eyes flashing with determination. "He won't. I'll make sure of it." Over the next few days, life returned to a cautious normalcy. Maggie threw herself into her art, finding solace in the creative process. Ethan continued to support her, though he couldn't ignore the nagging worry Richard's appearance had planted in his mind. He began making discreet inquiries, using his resources to learn more about the man who had caused Maggie so much pain. The answers he found only deepened his concern. Richard was a failed art dealer who had once been a rising star in the art world. His charm and connections had propelled him to the top, but his controlling nature and shady business practices had eventually caught up with him. Lawsuits, debts, and scandals had tarnished his reputation, leaving him bitter and desperate. Ethan realized that Richard's return wasn't just a coincidence. It was a calculated move, and Maggie's newfound success had likely reignited his interest. Ethan debated whether to tell Maggie what he had discovered. He didn't want to burden her, especially now that she was finally regaining her confidence. But his hesitation was cut short when Maggie appeared at his office one afternoon, visibly shaken. "I think someone's been following me," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched her coat. "I saw him. Richard. He was across the street from the cafe where I was meeting a friend. He didn't approach me, but he just stood there, watching." Ethan rose from his desk, his concern evident. "Are you sure it was him?" Maggie nodded. "I'm sure. I'd recognize him anywhere." Ethan clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "He's crossing a line," he said firmly. "I'll handle this." Maggie's eyes widened. "Ethan, please don't do anything rash. I've dealt with him before. I don't want you getting dragged into this." "You're not dealing with this alone," Ethan said, his voice steady but resolute. "He has no right to make you feel unsafe. Let me help." Reluctantly, Maggie agreed. Ethan immediately contacted his security team, instructing them to keep an eye on Maggie and monitor Richard's movements. He also hired a private investigator to gather more information on Richard, determined to protect Maggie at all costs. As the days passed, Maggie tried to focus on her art, but the shadow of Richard loomed over her. She found herself glancing over her shoulder in public, her heart racing at the slightest sound. The fear she had thought she had left behind was creeping back, threatening to undo all the progress she had made. Ethan, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated. Despite the precautions he had taken, Richard seemed to be slipping through the cracks, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. The private investigator reported that Richard was staying in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, but beyond that, there was little to go on. One evening, Ethan decided to confront Maggie about what had happened during her marriage to Richard. He felt there was more to the story, something she hadn't yet shared. They sat in the sunroom of the guest house, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light over the space. Maggie held a cup of tea in her hands, her gaze distant. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan began, his tone gentle. Maggie nodded. "Of course." "Why does Richard still have this hold over you?" he asked. "I know what he did to you was terrible, but there's something more, isn't there?" Maggie hesitated, her grip tightening on the cup. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and Ethan wondered if he had overstepped. But then she took a deep breath and began to talk. "Richard wasn't just controlling," she said quietly. "He was cruel, manipulative. He made me feel like I was nothing without him. At first, I didn't see it. He was charming, supportive, everything I thought I wanted. But once we got married, everything changed." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "He isolated me from my friends and family, convinced me to stop painting, and made me dependent on him. When I finally had the courage to leave, he threatened to ruin me. He said no one in the art world would take me seriously, that I'd never succeed without him. And for a long time, I believed him." Ethan listened intently, his heart aching for her. "He was wrong," he said firmly. "You've proven that. You're stronger than he ever gave you credit for." Maggie smiled faintly, though tears glistened in her eyes. "Maybe. But seeing him again, it's like all those old fears came rushing back." Ethan reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. "You're not the same person you were back then. You've rebuilt your life, Maggie. And you're not alone this time." That night, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't sit back and let Richard continue to torment Maggie. With the private investigator's latest report in hand, he drove to the motel where Richard was staying. The place was seedy, with flickering neon lights and peeling paint. Ethan's presence in his tailored suit and luxury car was out of place, drawing curious stares from the few people lingering outside. He found Richard's room and knocked on the door, his jaw set. A moment later, the door opened, and Richard stood there, his expression shifting from surprise to smugness. "Well, if it isn't Maggie's knight in shining armor," Richard drawled, leaning against the doorframe. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan didn't mince words. "Stay away from Maggie. This is your only warning." Richard smirked, clearly unfazed. "And what are you going to do if I don't? She's still my wife, you know. Legally, anyway." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You're mistaken if you think you still have any claim on her. She's moved on, and so should you. If you keep harassing her, I'll make sure you regret it." Richard chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. Big words from a man who doesn't know what he's dealing with. "But fine. Consider your warning received. For now." Ethan didn't trust Richard's apparent compliance, but he had made his point. As he walked away, he vowed to protect Maggie, no matter what it took. He had faced plenty of challenges in the business world, but this was personal. And he wasn't going to back down. Back at the guest house, Maggie was waiting anxiously, her heart sinking when she saw Ethan's expression as he walked in. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. "I talked to him," Ethan admitted. "I told him to stay away from you." Maggie's eyes widened in alarm. "Ethan, you shouldn't have. He's dangerous." "So am I," Ethan said simply, his tone resolute. "You're not going to face him alone, Maggie. Not this time." Maggie didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified, but one thing was certain: the battle with Richard was far from over. And as the past began to resurface in ways neither of them could anticipate, Maggie and Ethan would be forced to confront not only Richard but also their own fears, doubts, and the unspoken bond that was growing between them. The reckoning begins. The following days were fraught with tension. Maggie tried to immerse herself in her art, but her thoughts were clouded by worry. The encounter with Richard had reopened old wounds she thought had healed, and the knowledge that Ethan had confronted him only added to her anxiety. Yet beneath her fear, there was a glimmer of gratitude. Ethan's unwavering support was like a lifeline, pulling her back from the abyss. Ethan, for his part, was relentless. He worked behind the scenes to ensure Maggie's safety, leveraging every resource at his disposal. He tightened security around his estate, installed advanced surveillance systems, and enlisted his legal team to explore ways to protect Maggie from Richard's interference. Though his professional life demanded his attention, his focus remained on Maggie. Protecting her had become more than a responsibility. It was personal. One evening, as Maggie worked on a new painting in the sunroom, Ethan arrived with a folder in hand. He set it down on the table beside her, his expression serious. "What's this?" Maggie asked, setting her brush down and wiping her hands on a rag. "Everything we've uncovered about Richard," Ethan said. "His financial troubles, his legal issues, and his connections." Maggie hesitated, her stomach twisting in knots. "Connections?" Ethan nodded grimly. "It seems he's been working with some unsavory people. Loan sharks, to be specific. He's in deep debt, Maggie. That's probably why he's targeting you now. He sees your success as a way to dig himself out of the hole he's in." Maggie's heart sank. The thought of Richard using her as a pawn in his schemes was almost too much to bear. "I knew he had problems, but this." Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "This isn't your fault. He's desperate, and desperate people make bad decisions. But that doesn't mean you have to suffer because of him." Maggie nodded, though her mind was racing. She hated feeling like a victim, like her life was once again being dictated by Richard's actions. "What do we do?" she asked softly. "We build a case," Ethan said. "If he keeps harassing you, we'll have enough to file a restraining order. And if he crosses the line again, we'll make sure he faces the consequences." Maggie swallowed hard, her fear mingling with a growing sense of determination. She wasn't the sane woman Richard had bullied and controlled. She had fought her way back from nothing, and she wasn't about to let him drag her down again. The next day, Ethan's private investigator delivered a new piece of information. Richard had been seen meeting with a gallery owner in the city. Concerned that he might be planning to undermine Maggie's reputation, Ethan decided to investigate further. He and Maggie went to the gallery in question under the guise of potential buyers. The owner, a polished woman named Clarissa, greeted them warmly, unaware of their true intentions. As they strolled through the gallery, Ethan subtly steered the conversation toward Richard. "Oh, Richard," Clarissa said, her tone dismissive. "Yes, he's been in here a few times, trying to sell me some exclusive pieces, he called them. But I've dealt with his kind before. Charming on the surface, but nothing but trouble underneath." Maggie's chest tightened. "Did he say anything about me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear simmering beneath the surface. Clarissa raised an eyebrow, studying Maggie with interest. "You're the artist, aren't you? He did mention your name. Claimed he was your representative, or something like that. But I didn't believe him for a second. His reputation precedes him." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone polite. "Thank you for sharing that. If he comes back, I'd appreciate it if you'd let us know." Clarissa nodded. "Of course. And for what it's worth, your work is remarkable," she said to Maggie. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As they left the gallery, Maggie felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that Clarissa hadn't fallen for Richard's lies, but anger that he was still trying to manipulate her life. "Why can't he just leave me alone?" she muttered as they walked to Ethan's car. "Because he's a parasite," Ethan said bluntly. "He thrives on control and manipulation. But we won't let him win, Maggie. Not this time." That evening, as Maggie and Ethan sat in the guest house, an unexpected knock at the door startled them both. Ethan motioned for Maggie to stay back as he opened the door, revealing a young woman with a nervous expression. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, his tone cautious. The woman nodded. "My name is Lily. I work with Richard, or at least I did. I need to talk to Maggie." Maggie stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice wary. Lily glanced between Maggie and Ethan, then sighed. "I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't stay silent. Richard's planning something. He's desperate to get his hands on your money, and he'll do whatever it takes." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Lily hesitated, then pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and handed it to Ethan. It was a copy of a contract, one that named Richard as Maggie's legal representative and granted him control over her art sales. "He forged it," Lily said. "He's planning to use it to claim a percentage of your earnings. He thinks no one will question it because of your past relationship." Ethan's grip on the paper tightened, his anger palpable. "This is fraud," he said. "We can take this to the authorities." Lily nodded. I wanted to warn you. I couldn't let him get away with it." Maggie felt a wave of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she said softly. "You didn't have to do this." Lily smiled faintly. "He's hurt too many people already. It's time someone stood up to him." That night, Ethan and Maggie worked together to compile all the evidence they had against Richard. The forged contract, the reports from the private investigator, and Lily's testimony painted a damning picture. Ethan contacted his legal team, instructing them to prepare for a court battle if necessary. But even as they planned their next steps, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that Richard wouldn't go down without a fight. He had always been cunning, always found a way to manipulate the situation to his advantage. And though she was determined to stand her ground, the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. As the first light of dawn broke over the city, Ethan turned to Maggie, his expression both tired and resolute. "We'll get through this," he said, "together." Maggie nodded, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "I know," she said. "I just hope it's enough." Neither of them realized just how far Richard was willing to go, or how the battle ahead would test not only their courage, but the very foundation of their bond. But one thing was certain: they wouldn't face it alone. The storm unleashed. The days that followed Lily's revelation were a whirlwind of preparation and uncertainty. Ethan's legal team worked tirelessly to prepare a case against Richard, filing preliminary paperwork to challenge the forged contract. At the same time, they filed a restraining order on Maggie's behalf, bolstered by Lily's testimony and the surveillance footage from Ethan's estate, which confirmed Richard's loitering near the property. But despite their best efforts, the tension was palpable. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm was about to break. Ethan, ever the stoic protector, spent hours strategizing and ensuring that Maggie's safety and reputation were secured. Still, even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie sat alone in the sunroom, staring at a blank canvas. She had tried to paint, but the weight of Richard's threats had sapped her creativity. The brushes and paints sat untouched on the table, mocking her inability to focus. She was about to give up when Ethan entered, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her a glass. Maggie managed a small smile. "Thanks. I'm sorry, Ethan. I feel like I'm letting you down." Ethan frowned, setting his glass down and kneeling beside her chair. "Maggie, you're not letting anyone down. You've been through hell, and you're still standing. That's more than most people could manage." She sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass. "It just feels like no matter how far I've come, Richard is always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to drag me back." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "He doesn't control you anymore. You're stronger than he ever gave you credit for, and you're not alone this time. We'll face him together." Maggie looked into his eyes, finding a depth of sincerity that brought tears to her own. She nodded, the knot in her chest loosening just enough for her to take a deep breath. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." The next morning, Maggie woke to find Ethan gone, a note on the kitchen counter explaining that he had an early meeting with his legal team. She decided to take a walk through the estate's gardens, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. The vibrant blooms and neatly trimmed hedges offered a stark contrast to the chaos in her life, and for a brief moment, she felt a semblance of peace. But that peace shattered when she spotted a figure near the edge of the property. At first, she thought it was one of Ethan's security guards, but as the figure moved closer, she recognized him. Richard. Her heart raced as she froze, unsure of what to do. Richard, dressed in a wrinkled suit, looked disheveled but determined. He stopped a few feet away, his expression a mixture of smugness and anger. "Hello, Maggie," he said, his voice dripping with false charm. "You've done well for yourself. Quite the upgrade from when we were together." Maggie forced herself to stand tall, even as her legs trembled. "You're trespassing, Richard. Leave before I call security." Richard chuckled, his smile cold and predatory. "Come now, Maggie. Is that any way to talk to someone who helped you get where you are? Or have you forgotten how much I invested in you back then?" "Invested?" Maggie spat, anger flaring in her chest. "You didn't invest in me, Richard. You destroyed me. You took everything I loved and crushed it under your heel." His smile faltered, replaced by a sneer. "Careful, Maggie. You wouldn't want to ruin that pretty little career of yours with baseless accusations. Remember, I still have that contract." Maggie clenched her fists, refusing to let him intimidate her. "It's a forgery, and you know it. Ethan's lawyers are already tearing it apart. You won't win this time, Richard." Richard's eyes darkened, his calm facade cracking. "You think your rich boyfriend can protect you. You think his money and lawyers will scare me off. You have no idea what I'm capable of." Before Maggie could respond, one of Ethan's security guards appeared, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his vest. "Ma'am, is everything all right here?" Maggie exhaled shakily, relief flooding her. "Yes, thank you. Please escort Mr. Richard off the property." The guard nodded, stepping between her and Richard. "You need to leave, sir. Now." Richard glared at Maggie, his expression a promise of retaliation. But he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. As soon as he was out of sight, Maggie sank onto a nearby bench, her hands trembling. When Ethan returned later that day, Maggie told him everything. His reaction was immediate and fierce. "That's it," he said, pacing the room. "We're escalating this. He's crossed the line, and I won't let him get away with it." Ethan spent the next several hours on the phone with his legal team, the private investigator, and the security company. By the time he was done, additional measures had been put in place: more guards, enhanced surveillance, and an expedited hearing for the restraining order. But even with these precautions, the tension in the air was palpable. Maggie couldn't help but feel like Richard was always one step ahead, always finding a way to invade her life. A week later, the hearing for the restraining order arrived. Maggie and Ethan sat side by side in the courtroom, their lawyer presenting the evidence against Richard. Lily testified, recounting Richard's forgery and his threats against Maggie. The surveillance footage was shown, clearly depicting Richard loitering near Ethan's property. Richard, representing himself, tried to dismiss the claims as exaggerated, painting himself as a concerned ex-husband who had simply been misunderstood. But his smug demeanor began to crack under the weight of the evidence, and by the end of the hearing, the judge ruled in Maggie's favor. The restraining order was granted, prohibiting Richard from contacting Maggie or coming within 100 yards of her. It was a victory, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the end. That night, as they celebrated the court's decision, Ethan noticed that Maggie still seemed tense. "You should feel proud," he said. "You stood up to him and won." Maggie nodded, but her smile was faint. "I know. It's just, Richard doesn't give up that easily. He'll find another way." Ethan's expression grew serious. "Then we'll be ready. Whatever he throws at us, we'll face it together." Maggie looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I hope you're right," she said softly. But as the shadows lengthened outside the windows, both of them knew that the battle with Richard was far from over. The storm he had unleashed was still gathering strength, and the final confrontation was looming closer than either of them could have imagined. A reckoning and redemption. The gallery buzzed with life as collectors, critics, and admirers poured in to view Ruth's first solo exhibition. It was a surreal moment for both Ruth and Ethan. She stood amid a whirlwind of praise and awe, a figure who had risen from the ashes of despair to reclaim her identity. Ethan watched from a distance, proud and deeply moved. The paintings told her story, raw, painful, yet filled with hope. Each brushstroke seemed to whisper resilience and defiance. Yet, amid the celebration, Ethan couldn't shake the tension in the air. Ruth had been distracted in the days leading up to the exhibition, her normally sharp demeanor clouded by unease. He knew the source of her anxiety. Richard, the man who had once broken her spirit, had resurfaced at her debut, his presence casting a shadow over her triumph. As the evening progressed, Ethan kept a watchful eye on the room. Ruth mingled with guests, her confidence growing with each passing moment. But every so often, her gaze darted to the gallery doors. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. Richard strode in, exuding an air of arrogance that set Ethan on edge. Richard approached Ruth, his smile as sharp as a blade. "Ruth," he said smoothly, "a remarkable turnout. I always knew you had talent." Ruth's shoulders stiffened, but she held her ground. "You didn't think so when you told me my art was worthless." "Come now," Richard replied, his tone oozing false charm. "Let's not dwell on the past. I'm here to celebrate your success." Ethan stepped forward, his presence a silent warning. "Ruth doesn't need your support," he said firmly. "She's done this on her own." Richard's eyes narrowed as he turned to face Ethan. "Ah, the knight in shining armor. I was wondering when you'd show up." "I'm not here to argue," Ethan said coolly. "I'm here to make sure Ruth gets the recognition she deserves, without interference from anyone who tried to hold her back." Richard's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You don't know anything about our history. I know enough, Ethan replied. And I know Ruth doesn't need you in her life. Ruth, emboldened by Ethan's support, took a step forward. Richard, you don't intimidate me anymore. Whatever hold you think you have over me is gone. So please, leave. Richard's face darkened, his charm giving way to bitterness. You'll regret this, he hissed, before storming out of the gallery. The evening ended on a high note, with Ruth's paintings garnering praise and several pieces sold to collectors. As the last guests departed, Ruth finally allowed herself to relax. Ethan found her sitting on a bench in the gallery's garden, staring at the starry sky. You handled that beautifully, Ethan said, sitting beside her. Ruth let out a soft laugh. I didn't feel so composed in the moment. You stood up to him, Ethan said. That's more than most people can do. Ruth turned to him, her expression thoughtful. I wouldn't have gotten here without you, Ethan. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Ethan shook his head. I gave you a place to start. The rest was all you. In the days following the exhibition, Ruth's success grew. Her story of resilience captivated the media, drawing attention to her art and the journey that had led her to this moment. With Ethan's guidance, she established a foundation to support struggling artists, providing resources and opportunities for those who might otherwise be overlooked. But as Ruth's star rose, Ethan found himself grappling with his own feelings of inadequacy. For years, he had defined himself by his wealth and status, but Ruth's journey had shown him a deeper sense of purpose. He began to question the legacy he wanted to leave behind. One evening, as they shared dinner in the guest house, Ethan voiced his thoughts. Ruth, do you ever feel like you've been living someone else's life? Ruth looked at him curiously. What do you mean? I inherited my parents' business when I was barely out of college, Ethan explained. I've been running it ever since, but I'm not sure it's what I want to do. Seeing you find your passion again, it's made me realize how much I've been running on autopilot. Ruth nodded thoughtfully. Maybe it's time you found your own path, Ethan. What would you do if you weren't running the business? Ethan hesitated. I don't know, but I think I'd like to find out. Inspired by Ruth's courage, Ethan began exploring new opportunities. He started mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing his experiences, and helping them navigate the challenges of starting a business. He also launched initiatives to support underprivileged communities, using his wealth to create meaningful change. Through these efforts, Ethan discovered a sense of fulfillment he had never felt before. The more he gave back, the more he felt connected to the world around him. Ruth, too, continued to thrive. She moved out of the guest house and into her own studio apartment in the city, but her bond with Ethan remained strong. They often collaborated on projects, their shared experiences forging a deep and lasting friendship. 1 year after their fateful meeting, Ethan and Ruth stood together at the grand opening of a community center they had co-founded. The center was dedicated to providing art programs, job training, and support for those in need, a testament to the transformative power of compassion and resilience. As they cut the ribbon, Ethan turned to Ruth with a smile. You've come a long way. So have you, Ruth replied. And I think we're just getting started. In that moment, Ethan realized that wealth wasn't measured by the size of one's bank account, but by the impact one could make on the lives of others. Together, he and Ruth had turned their pain into purpose, proving that even the most unlikely encounters could lead to extraordinary change.